How many of you have been told this by a young person that you know? I have, by my son. And it's not because he doesn't love me. He does love me, I think. But he and his generation have grown up feeling climate dread. They see what the old Chinese proverb said: if we keep going the direction we're going to get to where we're headed. That climate dread makes them feel angry, hopeless, and that the adults in the room are kind of sitting on their hands, dithering. That's the path they see. But we can change that path. We can change it in a way which is remarkably straightforward, practical, and wonderfully restorative of people and the planet. And that path runs through a radical and practical transformation, as radical, profound, and practical as what we're doing in transportation. It runs through transforming how we manage forests. And that can change the direction that we are going with the climate crisis in 5 years. We know forests are important. We love forests. They're places where we go for renewal, for healing. But they are also 50% of the climate solution globally. And that is because, as we know, trees absorb carbon dioxide as they grow, and they release oxygen, but they also release that carbon dioxide when they are cut down, when they are harvested. When we lose those forests, we also lose an incredibly powerful tool that some of you may or may not know. This is my fun fact. The bacteria that live on the bark of older trees, you know what they eat for breakfast? Does everybody know what they eat for breakfast? They eat cow farts. They eat methane. And the bigger the tree, the more the bacteria, the more methane they eat. And it's estimated that they can, properly managed, eat 10% of the excess methane in the atmosphere. And methane is 80 times as potent a greenhouse gas as is carbon dioxide. So there's an enormous amount of climate benefit that we get from trees, but really in seeing the forest for the trees. So properly managed, forests can be 50% of our solution. So how are we managing today? Well, 40% of the excess CO2 in the atmosphere today comes from forest loss, forest simplification. That's kind of the reverse of what we need to be doing. It also means that even if we stopped all fossil fuel utilization today, we'd still have 44% of the problem in the atmosphere, and we would be contributing to that every year because we would still have forest loss and simplification. Now, given all the benefits that we know that we have, why are we doing that? Well, we're doing that because that's what we pay landowners to do. Now, many of you might think that forest loss was an issue really confined to the tropics. Well, the United States is a sleeper in this. In the United States, we lose about 6,000 acres of forest a day. That's the size of the state of Delaware every year that we lose to conversion. That's a one-way street away from forests. Why? Because it pays landowners to do that. In the United States, 60% plus of our forests are privately owned. They're owned as an asset. Landowners sell it. The other issue is that we cut a lot of trees. This is the typical way that we harvest trees. Gets you the most money, the most quickly, and it's an enormous cause of CO2 emissions. About 2/3 of the CO2 in a forest is released to the atmosphere. When you harvest, about 1/3 goes into products or back into the soil. When that happens, of course, we lose not only that carbon sequestration, but we also lose the methane digestion. Of course, we know when we plant trees, they can absorb CO2 again. But those new trees are small, say the size of my finger. And when trees absorb CO2, they lay it down as carbon on the outside of that stem. So you remember the first picture that I showed you of a beautiful old-growth forest, of which we have very little left. Well, those trees also are putting carbon dioxide on the outside of the stem. It's a massive amount. Older trees store more carbon. Older forests store more carbon, not only existing, but every year they store more. So in the United States, and actually globally, we have very young trees in our forests that we manage. Why? Because the younger they are means that you can harvest them quickly, you get more money back more quickly. So you want a rapid turn. Even though these are beings that live for hundreds and thousands of years, we on average manage them to be 40 years or less, sometimes 10 years and less. That means that in the United States, at any rate, we are storing 10 to 50% at most of the carbon in our forests that we could be. Now that's a big problem, but in that problem lies the solution. Because we actually have the opportunity to change how we manage forests to this. This is what we call natural forest management, something that we practice. And that is we work with those very young forests and we harvest them differently. We still cut trees, as you can see right here. We cut trees in a way that we are restoring spacing, we are restoring light that enables the residual trees to grow bigger. And within 7 to 10 years, we have reabsorbed all the CO2 that we released when we harvested. So what does that mean? It means that in 20 years in the forests that we manage, we have doubled, tripled, and quadrupled the amount of carbon that is stored in the forest while still cutting trees. Kind of magical. Now, in the process of doing that, so what are the results? We have a lot of people employed, but we have harvested enough to frame 3,000 houses, and we've also harvested enough fiber to produce 1 million reams of paper. I happen to like writing on paper, so I like that. But we employ loggers, foresters, biologists, truck drivers, people who install culverts, people in quarries who create rock for the roads, people in the mills. It's a very powerful driver for rural communities. And every dollar that is spent in a rural community tends to circulate at least 10 times. It's a very circular economy there. This is made possible by this really simple, really straightforward method of just changing the how and why of how we manage. So I want to go back to the fact that in these 20 years, what have we done? We've doubled, tripled, and quadrupled the amount of carbon in the forest, and we've actually created more timber products than we were before, as well as having habitat for 800 species. All of us are aware of the intensification of weather events with climate change. This is one, drought. This is another benefit of these older forests that we're managing for, because on average, by taking less than what is in the forest, by changing away from that industrial model, that intensive forestry model, we have older forests on average. Well, those older forests can double the amount of water that we store, as well as cleaning it and regulating its flow. Many of you saw what happened in North Carolina and in Spain. When you have older, more mature forests, they slow the water down. They reduce the likelihood of intense flooding by 40%. That's pretty huge. all of us have experienced wildfires. So some people say, well, why would you work with forests? They're all going to burn up, right? This shows what happens when you manage forests to be more natural and older. It's a 75% risk reduction in terms of intensive fire. And in North America, all of our forests are fire adapted. So it's not a question of if, it's a question of when, and it's a question of how. And so we know our forests in the US are very, very altered. They're very young, as I said, and they're too crowded with too many young trees. It's kind of the philosophy that a couple of generations back, people would say, women are having 18 children, why? Well, because 3 or 4 would survive. And we've done that in our so-called forest management. We plant too many trees to the acre, and that is not a healthy situation. It burns really quickly. Most of those trees are also clones. Did anybody here ever see Star Wars? You remember the clones, the Clone Wars? Well, one of the problems with clones is if one has a flaw, they all have a flaw. And climate change is about nothing if not more stress. And so you don't want just young clones. You want a mixed population. And of course, forests are treasure houses of biodiversity. So we can see that an older, more natural forest is really much more carbon rich. It's also much more climate resilient, and our environment is changing that we need that resilience. That means it's less risky. That also means that from a business proposition, it's less risky because the forests that we're managing this way are not going to burn up. Now, how many of you, what's the first thing that comes to your mind? The very first thing that comes to your mind when you say climate change solution? For the vast majority of people, it's electric cars. I drive an electric car. I know that it's taking me 5 years to get back to carbon zero in that electric car, to reduce my emissions to zero because of the intensive process of developing the batteries for electric cars. And also, the lithium mines associated with electric cars have some real downsides. But you have to wait 5 years. We have 5 years to go. If you change the direction of how we manage standing forests today, changing the industry today to one to managing for climate, as well as timber products, we start making that difference today. And we can do it on a really massive scale if we move our perception of forests of the optional solution to the core solution. 40% of the problem means it ought to be a core solution. What do we do when we have significant infrastructure issues? In the United States, we look at what we call public-private partnerships, where the public bears the cost of shifting what's wrong with infrastructure to benefit the public. And then it has the private sector maintain it. We do this with roads, hospitals, research, battery development, storage. We haven't done this with forests, and we haven't done it with nature, but we have a tool that exists to do that in the United States, and we are just beginning to embrace it. And that tool is called a working forest conservation easement. It's something that the public can buy that pays landowners for the opportunity cost of shifting what they do. Because remember, if we keep doing what we're doing, we get to where we're headed, so we have to change what we're doing with forests. And conservation easements are a core tool for shifting how we do that. In California, I've been very pleased to be part of a process whereby the state has now designated for the first time anywhere in the world to include forests and other lands in its climate targets, and has now pledged to conserve hundreds of thousands of acres of working forest every year. So I'm not talking about setting aside parks. I'm not talking about, the other side, which is just keep doing what we're doing on the plantation side. I'm talking about that sweet middle ground where we are changing how we manage forests on the day-to-day. So what will that get us? We estimate that it'll yield about 300 million tons of CO2 emissions reductions. That's not counting the methane. 300 million tons of emissions reductions a year by 2030. So what would happen if we did that all over the United States? The United States is 1/3 forested. Yes, we have lost about 40% of our forest, but we're still 1/3 forested. That's a massive scale. As of today, the United States has a goal of reducing 1.8 billion tons of CO2 emissions a year. If we did this across the United States, working with private forest landowners, we could be reducing every year 1.25 to 1.5 billion tons. Those numbers I mentioned in California, that's with working with a tiny fraction, well under 10% of the private forest lands in the state. So this doesn't have to be everybody, everywhere, all at once, but it's an extraordinarily powerful tool. That is 60 to 80% of what we need to do. But we can start that right now, and it results in hundreds and hundreds of millions of tons of emissions reductions now. This isn't rocket science. It's a lot cheaper than rocket science. It's incredibly cost-effective. It's so near term. This is the way to turn my son's climate dread on its head and head us in the direction of climate health. And it's something that everybody can do, no matter where they live in the US, they can engage in this. It's a combination of policy and practice, and it's something that is so tangible. We all know the difference about walking into a well-managed forest. We feel it. You breathe it. And that is working with our natural forests, the ones that grow here naturally. That makes it easy. So with that, I think the issue of facing a crowd of justifiably angry, unhappy young people, you can do the jujitsu and say, come with us. Come, let us be profound, let us be radical, and let us transform what the future looks like. Thank you.